Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Buffalo Bills Center of the West. My name is Eric Rosborough. I am Associate Librarian and Senior Cataloger here at the McLaughlin Research Library. We're really excited about today's program today. Brian and I were working on the slides yesterday, and I got to see some of them, and I'm very excited about today's talk, and we'll be learning all about the South Fork. Really appreciate your guys' continued support. We will be having another program in November on a date to be determined, so please keep your eye out for that. And if you have any questions, you can always give me a call. With that, we've got Brian Beauvais, who's going to be talking about ranching on the South Fork, which is, to me, a fascinating topic and a fascinating place. Brian is the curator, if you don't know, at the Park County Archives, and he serves on a bunch of local commissions. He serves on the Park County Historic Preservation Commission, the Wyoming Historical Foundation, and the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund. Brian and some other people have been really involved up on Cedar Mountain lately, and they're working on refurbishing the buffalo up there as a memorial to Buffalo Bill. And if you want to, you should talk about that after, because I think they're looking for volunteers. Brian has written extensively and given public presentations on a wide range of topics in Northwest Wyoming history, including wildlife conservation, mining, prospecting, ranching, homesteading, historic preservation, vernacular architecture, and art. You may have caught, we filmed these and put them on YouTube. Brian gave another talk on mining in the area, which is very interesting, and also another one on the history of game preservation. Anyway, let's get to today's talk, and I would like to give you my friend and colleague, Brian Beauvais.
Let me get situated here. This is on, and we have a little trigger. Howdy! Thanks for showing up to this. It makes me feel good that people show up for local history events. We need to thank the Buffalo Bill Center of the West and the McLaughlin Research Library for hosting these, because programs like this about local history are so important for making sure these stories don't get lost. And we should thank Mr. Bob Richard, whose idea these talks were. And I'm just going to say up front, folks, I am not the expert on South Fork history. I don't know really who is, but I hope that by doing this program, more of these historical stories that you folks know come out, and you talk about them, and we can document them, so all that stuff isn't lost and forgotten forever. And just a heads up again, I'm going to burst your bubble right away. I'm only going to be able to talk about the very tip of the iceberg about homesteading and ranching on the South Fork. I realize that maybe this topic was, we don't have time to talk about all history of ranching on the South Fork. That's ridiculous. We would be here until dinner if we were going to do that. So I'm just going to talk about very early homesteaders and ranching. And when I say homesteaders, I'm referring to folks who got land, government land, from using the U.S. Homestead Act of 1862. So they got 160 acres of almost free land by living on it for 5 years and improving it and making it productive, whatever that means. It's kind of a subjective criteria. And then after they completed all that, they got title to that land, and it became their private property. So it's a way of turning the upper South Fork Valley of just a no man's land of government land into a bunch of different parcels of private property that you saw on that map when you walked in the door. So let's just start out by saying that there's loads of Native American history on the South Fork and everywhere that I'm totally unqualified to talk about. I'm not an archaeologist, but we'll just say that early mountain men talked about big winter camps of Crow on the upper South Fork. And even early settlers said that the Crow would go live out there every winter and hunt game. So this is a 1814 map by Mr. William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And you can see it's a little bit weird, right? Like Hart Mountain is south of the Stinking Water, but they have these boiling springs, and you have this creek, which is the Grass House River, which was the original name of the North Fork. And then you have the Salt Fork, which is the South Fork. Mr. John Coulter here, when he circumnavigated the Yellowstone region in the winter of 1807, 1808, said that there was a big salt mine up at the head of the South Fork. And no one's ever been able to find this thing. So if you know where it is, please let me know, and you'll sort of blow open this big historical mystery. But on a lot of early maps, you see the South Fork called the Salt Fork, or even it's just called the Ishua River. So in 1879, there's a big drought in Wyoming, and much of Wyoming. And Judge Carter of Fort Bridger, all the way down here, he hears through some of his Native American connections that the drought didn't really affect the Bighorn Basin up here. You can see at this point we're in Sweetwater County. And then there's Pease County, that doesn't even exist anymore. And I love looking at these old maps. I really want to give a presentation just on old maps of Park County because they're fascinating. This one's a little bit more accurate, but you can see it has Meeteetse Creek flowing into the Stinking Water, which is inaccurate. Anyways, so Peter McCullough, who was an immigrant from Scotland, a Civil War veteran, and Carter's ranch manager, was assigned the responsibility of driving a few thousand head of his cattle up into the Bighorn Basin and finding a place to make a cow camp. And they came into the Stinking Water region when there's really not a lot of other white folks around. Maybe a few buffalo hunters moving around, some trappers and some prospectors, but no permanent white residents. And they set up their headquarters on a little creek flowing off of a big, long mountain just west of the Stinking Water Canyon. These are later recorded as Carter Creek and Carter Mountain, although, again, old geographic references originally called that Meeteetse Mountain. And this is one of their original buildings there. You can see it's whitewashed. The Carter Company was called the Bug Outfit because of their brand there. And these cattle were just left out on the open range to just forage wherever they wanted to go. There's no fences. There's no private property. It's all just free grazing on government land. And they have their headquarters on Carter Creek, but they also have camps kind of scattered around the landscape, one of them being in McCullough Peaks, obviously named for Pete McCullough. If you've ever been to the old stone barn out in the McCullough Peaks, that was an early Carter Ranch camp. And that stone barn is collapsed a few years ago, if you guys have been out there. So the South Fork and the foothills of the Absarokas is a great place to graze cattle on the open range. There's plenty of grass. The winter wind blows a bunch of snow away, as I'm sure you're aware. A few miles up the river, there's this big stone column that reminds Peter McCullough of a castle, a tower house back in Scotland. So he calls this Castle Rock, which I think is maybe a little bit better than what the Native Americans called it, which was the wolf penis. I'm sure residents of the South Fork Valley don't want to say that they live in the valley of the wolf penis. In 1897, Buffalo Bill bought the Carter Ranch after a short succession of owners. And then in 1911, he sold it to W.R. Coe, who had been out hunting with A.A. Anderson. Captain Henry Belknap was kind of from all over, born in Massachusetts, graduated from Harvard, traveled around the world on business to Europe and India, and he served as a captain in the U.S. infantry during the Civil War. And although he resided in New York and Boston, Belknap was an early businessman, really involved and invested in the development of Billings, back when it was just like a steamboat town at the end of the rail line. He had the Belknap block just in downtown Billings, and he had a couple of the first brick buildings in Billings, Montana. But he also started a cattle ranch on the South Fork in 1880 on what became known as Belknap Creek. And it's amazing what you can name when you're the first white folks in the area. They had an upper cow camp a few miles up the river, the South Fork, which was later purchased by Buffalo Bill, and it became the TE. So when we're talking about the Carter Ranch and the Belknap Ranch, we're really talking about open range cattle ranching. Ranching on the open range did not involve buying or owning property. It was all just free government land with really no regulations, right? The Taylor Grazing Act didn't come about until the 1930s. You can just graze your animals for free wherever. They didn't really make an effort to feed their cattle, these early cows. Again, the cattle just foraged for themselves. So this system doesn't really require a lot of animal husbandry, and it's pretty gosh dang profitable because it doesn't require an investment in infrastructure or manpower. You really just have to have some cattle and you push them out, and that's all you got to do. So there's maybe like a dozen big open range cattle ranches in the area, in the Cody area. Cody didn't exist yet, but in the area in the 1880s, the Otto Frank and Pitchfork Ranch down on the Grable, the Bar TL, the Lower Grable, owned by Mr. Archibald Rogers, who was a neighbor of the Roosevelts on the Hudson, George Baxter on the Grass Creek, Ashworth and Johnson on the Upper Grable and Sage Creek, John Chapman over on Pat O'Hara, the group of surly Frenchmen on Trail Creek north of Cody. And the major enterprise for these ranches was the yearly roundup. All the major ranchers in the area would send representatives to this organized roundup, which moved around to different places on the landscape all summer long. And they rounded up their stock twice a year, once in the spring to brand calves and castrate calves, and then again in the fall to cut out fat animals they wanted to send to market, if they wanted to send any to market. And given that the range was free government land, there's really no restrictions, there's little incentive to conserve the range, and there's really no barriers to running as many cattle as possible, right? This is like the tragedy of the commons. And as circumstances changed and more people settled in the area and homesteaded, that made their own homesteads, this all becomes a big problem because in the 1870s, beef prices were at an all-time high, which caused all these ranchers to move out to places like Wyoming because it's an easy, fast way to make money. And as these ranchers started putting cattle on the market, the price naturally went down. So then they started keeping beef back from the market, and they just kept the animals on the open range. So in 1883, there were reportedly 100,000 cattle just on the open range in the Bighorn Basin. There's a Billing Herald's article from May 1883 that noted that the Carter Ranch had 6,000 head and the Belknap Ranch had 3,000 head, kind of on the South Fork, but also into the basin. And let's just be clear, that's a heck of a lot of animals to be out grazing. And there's thousands of other animals from these other ranches. And this is really the crest of the cattle boom in Wyoming because the winter of 1886 and 1887 is nasty. There's a lot of snow, and the snow stays around, and it's bitter cold all winter long, and a bunch of cattle starve to death. Because like I said, ranchers didn't really concern themselves with feeding their animals because that would have eaten into their easy profits. So a lot of ranchers in Wyoming sort of either go out of business, and the Bighorn Basin was marginally better off than the rest of the state. But ranchers around here are really kind of just shells of what they were before these bad winters in the 1880s. And going forward, these cattle ranches look and operate a lot differently. First of all, they're much smaller, a lot less cattle. Secondly, they start to expend a great amount of time and effort and land into cultivation of winter feed. And it's interesting that these later ranches are essentially more about farming than the original type of ranching that was practiced on the open range. So when Milton Benedict is ranching on Bull Creek and the Shoshone Cattle Company at the Castle Rock Ranch, and Frank and Marion Williams are on Carter Creek, these ranches that get going in the 1890s and into the 20th century, these places are basically just farms growing feed for cattle. And just to reiterate, so even in the 1890s, at that very early date, the wild Old West of roving cowboys and big roundups and shootouts up at Arland is kind of the thing of the past. The wild and woolly open range cattle days didn't last long on the South Fork, maybe a little bit less than a decade. So for example, like my dogs lived on this earth longer than the open range cattle. The Old West existed here around Cody, so it was a very brief period of time. So after the decline of the open range and these, our local ranches essentially become farms that focus on winter feed. And that's what happens on a lot of the South Fork, the lower South Fork. We have lots of folks homesteading, and they essentially build what I would call kind of ranching farms. But I want to focus the rest of the talk more towards the upper South Fork, because things go a little bit differently up there. People still homestead on the bottomlands and irrigate pastures, but most of these homesteads just are not big enough to get enough feed for a working cattle ranch. But people have this land in a very beautiful setting, and some of them might run a few cattle. And what we see is this gradual trend on the upper South Fork away from working ranches and towards recreational ranches. Dude ranches, hobby ranches, trophy ranches, and just the broader gentrification of the neighborhood. One of the first settlers, white settlers on the upper South Fork, was Jim McLaughlin from Pennsylvania. He came out to Wyoming in 1889, apparently did some trapping in sunlight on the North Fork, and then settled down on the South Fork. And he was understandably lonely, living up in the head of that valley, probably by himself with not a lot of women around. So he started writing a matrimonial club back east, which put him in touch with Miss Virginia Thompson. And I should just say this form of courtship was pretty more common than you would think back then, because a lot of lonely guys living in the middle of nowhere and lots of women in cities who maybe can't find a good guy. So these matrimonial clubs exist to connect these two constituencies. So she came out to Wyoming, and Jim picked her up in Red Lodge, and after like a couple days, they got married. So, and they set up on the edge of a natural pasture down there on the upper South Fork. Here's their Valley Home Ranch. Nothing special about this. You can kind of see a little buggy right there with some seats, some bench seats. Just a small, crude ranch out in the sticks. And Jim was a hunting guide, and like a lot of other ranchers in the area, that he realized that people just like to experience the Wyoming mountains. So he started very informally taking in a few guests every summer. And they usually paid some form of board, but they also helped with ranch chores and made themselves useful. Jim McLaughlin didn't operate a full dude ranch because that didn't really exist yet. You can see here they have these tents set up, and that's where these visitors would stay. So it's not like you're living in luxury with your feet up all summer. Larry Laram and Winthrop Brooks of the Brooks Brothers clothing business came out a few summers to the Valley Home Ranch. And they clearly loved the experience, and they thought that their rich friends back in New York City would love it too. So in 1915, they bought McLaughlin's ranch as a business venture and started it into a big dude ranch catering to their social circles back east. And they ended up buying a bunch of the surrounding homesteads and built this large ranch composed of about a half dozen homesteads out there. Another early homesteader and rancher was Mr. Sam Aldrich. He was from Kansas, moved to Cody, moved to Park County or Wyoming in 1888. When he was 22, he was an early meat hunter and hunting guide up in Sunlight Basin. Then he moved on to the South Fork in 1890. set up along a little tributary that became known as Aldrich Creek. Married Iva Crane in 1899, so there's a Crane Creek on Upper South Fork too, named after her. And they set up this little ranch. They had a few cattle. They also took in some guests. In 1910, Mr. Owen Wister, the author, was one of their guests out there. And Aldrich, like his neighbors, was in the business of guiding hunters. I just love this photo with him and his pipe and his rifle. The McLaughlin is doing an exhibit on Western dress here, and I love to see how these people dress. In 1921, Sam and Iva Aldrich decided to move their operation downriver a ways to Iva's homestead, kind of by Hardpan Creek, and this became Aldrich Lodge. And they eventually sold their original ranch to James Ashley, who changed the name to the J Bar 9, J for James and 9 for the 9 members of his family. And then that ranch, sucked up a bunch of other homesteads in the area. Simeon Thayer, the Olsons, a bunch of other ones around there. In 1924, guests at Aldrich Lodge were poisoned by eating tainted canned olives. 5 people died of botulism, and this was front page news back in New York City. There was the headline that said, New York family dies on Wyoming ranch. And this almost ruined the dude business out here because it's horrible publicity. People don't want to think that they're going to die if they come on vacation. Luckily, ranchers didn't lose everything. People looked the other way. And the dude business only grew. So after 57 years of living in Wyoming, the Aldriches sold the Aldrich Lodge to Martin Littleton, a family from New York, in 1941, who had been guests at Valley Ranch. And the Littletons called the place the Quarter Circle A.H. Ranch. And then in 1955, they sold the ranch to Don and Ray Siggins because the property adjoined the Siggins Double L Bar. Now, one of the initial forces drawing early settlers to the South Fork were the mining prospects up at Needle Creek. And this is a whole other topic. Like Eric said, I gave a presentation about mining in the Absarokas a few years ago, so if you're interested in that, watch that presentation. But these were developed in the 1890s when some prospectors started pulling out galena ore of some tunnels. And this soon gets a lot of people's attention because in the 1890s, the Burlington Railroad was looking at and even surveying a rail line up the South Fork and then over the Continental Divide into the Buffalo River area and down into the Tetons. And this would make this mining area really profitable. It would also be it'd be really nice to have a homestead right along a rail line. So a bunch of prospectors move in. One of these prospectors is a guy from Red Lodge, an immigrant from Wales named John Davis. You sometimes see this with an E in here, John Davies. His nickname was John Reckless Davis, although I'm not sure what he seemed like a pretty good guy to me. In 1891, Davis builds a cabin on Cabin Creek, a few miles downriver from his mining operations at Needle Creek. And John Davis is basically just employed by a group of investors who are none other than the same guys trying to develop Cody. Buffalo Bill, George Beck, all the street names. The company basically just paid John Davis to oversee the mines, and the investors would occasionally go up there, and John Davis would show them around, and they would pretend to know how to inspect ore and stuff. This is John Davis right here. This is Buffalo Bill in the center. This is Buffalo Bill's friend, White Beaver Powell, and you can see a adit opening right there. But the mines fizzle out, and Davis sort of stays in Buffalo Bill's periphery, kind of organizing hunts on the South Fork. You see a lot of photos and paintings up in the Buffalo Bill Museum where John Davis is kind of in charge of organizing those hunts. And John Davis has the Lazy JD brand, which Larry Laram buys when he's working on developing Valley Ranch. Apparently, the McLaughlins kept their brand when they sold the ranch to Laram. And the early Majo sort of acted as a hunting, what am I trying to say? Oh yeah, so Davis sold the ranch on Cabin Creek in 1912 to brothers Joe and Monty Jones and another guy named Joe McGill. And they named it the Majo because they just combined the first two letters of their last names, McGill and Jones. And Davis ended up dying in 1914 when he ate tainted green beans up in Pahaska, so a lot of people are dropping from canned foods, although I assure you they're safe. Some of you might have known his daughter, Ruby Davies, who was a longtime South Fork resident. She died in 2001, and I wish we could talk about her. She was a very interesting gal. This photo is from 1912, and you can see the ranch really only consisted of this cabin, but the Jones brothers set up some tents for visiting hunters. And they used it really as a hunting outpost there at the end of the South Fork. And Joe Jones was running the show. Joe McGill lived in Thermopolis. He was kind of a silent partner. And Monty Jones was the manager of the TE, so he wasn't really doing much either. Here's a better picture of that original cabin complex. Again, nothing special. And they built these cabins over here, which is maybe a little improvement from those tents. This is Joe Jones right there. Right there. He's a good small guy, good at climbing up mountains looking for sheep. This is Joe Jones and a hunter at the head of Cabin Creek looking for sheep. And these guys make a good business taking hunters into the thoroughfare and up the South Fork. And that's really how the Majo operates. It's only a hunting ranch. They don't really have any cattle or anything like that. This has nothing to do with cattle. It's all recreation. Nova Brown and his mom, Euphrasia, settled on the upper South Fork in the 1890s. And I'm a big Nova Brown fan. I kind of just wanted to do this talk just so I could talk about Nova Brown. The Browns were from Kentucky, and they moved out to Wyoming when Nova's bad health made them look for a drier climate. And Nova went to high school up in Red Lodge, and there he met a guy named Johnny Rooks, who was a prospector with a squatter's claim up at the head of the South Fork, a few miles downriver from his mines on Needle Creek. And after Nova graduated, Rooks suggested that he join him as a partner on this little ranch. And Nova agreed to the arrangement as long as he could bring his mom along. So we know he was a good son. The partnership worked out well until 1896 when Rooks was killed in a shootout involving Pete and Minnie Snyder, some neighboring homesteaders on the South Fork, who had attempted to murder Sam Aldrich. So the story goes that Sam Aldrich and his ranch hands were playing cards in his cabin one day at the J-Bar 9 when someone fired a load of buckshot through the window trying to kill Sam, but luckily it only sort of ripped off his scalp and he fell unconscious. They found woman's boot tracks in the snow. Like, these people know how to commit murder. Like, there's snow and mud everywhere. They can just follow these boot tracks back to Pete and Minnie Snyder's ranch, which is a few miles upriver, kind of by the Flying H. And Aldrich and these guys tracked the assailant back to the Snyder Ranch, and they kept them under surveillance. But they weren't officers of the law, so they had to send for someone to go get Judge Benedict out at Bull Creek, which is a big, big ride. In the meantime, Pete and Minnie Snyder, they know what's up, and they plan to flee the country, so they hopped on their wagon and they got the heck out of there. But Sam Aldrich organized a posse of neighbors that took off after the Snyders, and one of these guys was Johnny Rooks. And they caught up with them right at Belknap Creek, Belknap Ranch. Or they caught up with them or they ambushed them there. The couple were ordered to surrender, and what transpires next is really hard to parse. Some sources say the Snyders opened fire, others say the posse started shooting. In any case, after the smoke clears, Mr. Johnny Rooks is dead. No one really knows who killed the guy, if it was the Snyders or it was friendly fire. But the Snyders surrender, and they're arrested and taken to Lander. These are their mug shots from the state archives. I love these. They're great photos. At their trial, Pete Snyder testifies that a few weeks prior to the shooting, he had caught Sam Aldrich and some of his cowboys branding calves owned by a different South Fork rancher. And when Pete confronted him about it, they said, "You better watch out, you better shut up." So there was bad blood. And this whole story is so hazy and confusing. I've read a bunch of different newspapers about it. I've read the trial transcripts. And it's impossible to figure out what actually happened here. But the Snyders don't have any witnesses on their side because they just moved into the area. And Sam Aldrich is kind of the boss of the South Fork. So the Snyders are convicted of murder. And Johnny Rooks is buried at the site of the shootout, right there on Belknap Creek. Now, I should thank Mr. Nick Patrick for taking me right to it. And Rooks has no relatives in the area, so his estate leaves the ranch, or the squatter's claim, to Mr. Nova Brown. And this is one of my favorite photos because you can really get a good idea of how these people were living. This old fence here and the sod roof on these cabins. Here's another one. This is Nova Brown and his wife, Iowa, right there. They just got done with laundry. Nova Brown and his mother, Euphrasia, I love that name, they eventually filed adjacent homesteads on the river bottom. And of course, they had to improve the land to acquire the patent, so they irrigated this hay field, and here they are collecting hay out there. And they named this place the NE for Nova's initials, Nova Eugene Brown. And Nova, like many of his neighbors, realized there's more opportunity facilitating recreation in what the historians call the new West than being a cattle rancher of the Old West. And that's what Nova's really good at. He's young, he's full of energy, he knows how to market himself, and he starts leading tours through Yellowstone National Park and advertising in popular magazines and just bringing people from around the country and around the world out to the South Fork. And he makes a good business taking hunters up in the mountains. He guides European aristocrats, and then he gets invited to their other hunts in India and Africa. So, frankly, Nova Brown has probably seen more of the world than I have. And to better facilitate hunting on the South Fork, Nova Brown and Jim McLaughlin and some other ranchers create the Deer Creek Trail. Here's the NE Ranch right there. The Coriels were his in-laws. So the original way to get from the thoroughfare from the South Fork is to go up this long, nasty cat trail of Ishua Creek. But these ranchers realized it was much quicker and easier to just go up Deer Creek, so they punched in a trail there. And if you've ever been on the Deer Creek Trail, you know it's kind of a weird trail, and it seems very sort of artificial and like it shouldn't be there, and that's because it shouldn't be there. People just made it out of nothing, out of rock walls. Nova built more log structures on the NE to accommodate more people. And again, I love this photo because it really shows what these guys were doing. They were cutting these logs up on Carter Mountain, and they would drag them down in the valley. This was the house they were building. It's a big, big improvement over those cabins that we saw before. And again, I love this little fence here, and you would see Valley Ranch do that later. This is the big house right there, and you can see those old cabins. And then they have a bunch of tents set up everywhere for visitors. And again, I cannot reiterate this enough. Even at this early date, in the 1890s, these ranches on the South Fork are less about traditional agriculture and ranching, and they function more as vacation spots. Here are those tents, probably set up most of the year for visitors. These are just early Airbnbs, back when no one was regulating them. Nova died in 1914 of a burst appendix. He became very ill on a hunt in the thoroughfare, and he had to be carried out on a sling strung between two horses going down the Deer Creek Trail. But he and his mother are buried out at Valley Cemetery. And Miss Iowa continued to run the NE. After Nova's death, she kept bringing in guests, and she was a very capable manager, but she struggled working with cowboys and their unwillingness to take orders from a lone woman. So in 1920, she sold the NE to her neighbor Arthur Cox, who in turn sold it to Larry Laram and Valley Ranch a few years later. And the NE became part of the A2Z Ranch, which is just part of the massive complex that is the Valley Ranch out there. And Iowa and her son Paul Ritter Brown ended up buying the Elk Creek Ranch in Sunlight Basin, the Ridgeways Ranch now, and going into the dude business up there, back when Paul was old enough that he could start giving orders to cowboys. The Deer Creek Ranch by Deer Creek was originally composed of two adjacent homesteads of Oliver and George Marks. I call them the Marks brothers, although I'm not really sure how developed their comedic sensibilities were. They operated the Cody Hotel, the first hotel in Cody, which was where the Silver Dollar Bar patio is. Oliver was an early game warden, hunting guide, outfitter, right? I kind of sound like a broken record here. And they moved off to California in the 1920s, and they sold the place to Barry Williams in 1922. And then he sold it to his sister, Hope William Reed, in 1926. And she was a noteworthy Broadway actress, a classic flapper of the 1920s. And this family had been dude guests at the Valley Ranch. And again, we see a lot of that. Dude guests coming out here, loving the experience, and then buying a piece of land and becoming residents, gentrifying the neighborhood, like I like to say. In 1936, Grace Eustace of New York City, who had been the guest of Hope Reed, bought the upper portion of the Deer Creek Ranch, and her nickname was Hawkeye. And that's why there's a Hawkeye Ranch up there. And Hope Reed and Grace Eustace had all sorts of fun hunting up in the mountains and rafting down the South Fork Canyon. Now we're going to jump downriver quick to Judge Aaron Swanson and his Cherry Springs Ranch. This was just across the river from the Aldrich place to the J-Bar 9 now. Judge Swanson was a native of Sweden. He came to the area around 1895. For a number of years, he was the justice of the peace on the South Fork, and so they called him Judge. He was kind of a small-time cattle rancher. So there's some folks raising cattle out here. But he also used his ranch as a jumping-off point for hunts and pack trips. Here he is with some horses, and you can see the little pass just south of the Ishua Hills there. In 1906, he married a mail-order bride from St. Louis, courtship totally by correspondence. And this lady moved out to the South Fork and brought her kid from a previous relationship. And this is a horrible story. Apparently, this relationship didn't really go that well, because in 1908, Judge Swanson killed his wife and then killed that kid and then killed himself. And I bring this up because, first of all, it's the truth and it's history, and also because I don't want to fall into the nostalgia trap of thinking that all these people were just living lives in the Garden of Eden, living pastoral bliss up on the South Fork. These people were human, just like us. They had problems, just like us, and tragic things happen. The ranch was later purchased by the Jewett family, who sold it to Merrill Snyder in 1921, who sold it to Nancy Carroll Draper in 1966, who was a mover and shaker here in the museum. And it's currently owned by the J-Bar 9. What is now the Ishua Mesa Ranch was homesteaded by Cyrus and Mary Catherine Snyder. No relation to Pete and Minnie Snyder, but it would have been pretty awkward to move into a neighborhood a couple years after these convicted murderers are taken away in chains. But Ma and Pa Snyder moved their family of 6 young sons from Nebraska into the Marquette area in 1896. And then they moved up on the South Fork when they heard that this proposed reservoir was going to flood their farm. And they settled along the river in a place that had originally been occupied by an old bachelor named Ernie Chung, who killed himself. So then all of a sudden this piece of land is all of a sudden available for settlement. Cyrus died in 1922 in a car wreck in the Shoshone Canyon, and his son Clarence Snyder owned and operated the ranch until 1947, when he sold it to Frank and Dorothy Winnett, who had been longtime guests at Valley Ranch. So this always circles back to like dude guests who buy up these places. Cyrus and Mary Snyder had 6 sons. This is a picture from 1969. These are the 6 surviving sons. There's actually 9 kids. And these guys were important figures on the South Fork. Simon, Perry, Merrill, Glenn, Clarence, and Harold. I already mentioned that Merrill Snyder owned the Cherry Springs Ranch. Perry Snyder was the manager of the Valley Ranch for years, and Clarence Snyder owned the family ranch after Pa Snyder died. Simon Snyder, the oldest brother, moved a few miles up the river and created his own little ranch, homesteaded his place, the Triangle Bar, which is now the Flying H. And as a young man, Simon had worked for Nova Brown at the NE and learned the dude business and how to be a hunting guide from Nova. So he did the same thing on his ranch. But if you've been to that place, it's kind of small as far as ranches go, and he couldn't homestead anything else around it. So in 1920, he sold his South Fork Ranch and bought the old John Painter Ranch up in Sunlight Basin and had a much bigger dude operation up there. And the Simon Snyder Ranch in Sunlight Basin is now the Game and Fish Ranch. The guy who bought Simon Snyder's South Fork Ranch was, you guessed it, a previous dude, Colonel Arthur Little of the Little and Ives Company of New York City. Right below the Snyder place was the Max Wild homestead, the Lazy Bar F. Max Wild came out to Wyoming in 1915, started working on pack trips for the Majo and Valley Ranch. Here he is as a camp cook. So he really knew his way around the whole pack trip business. And he filed a little homestead on a piece of land and started his outfitting business from the Lazy Bar F. Well, and with a name like Max Wild, it would have been a tragedy if the guy became an accountant or a school counselor or something. He had to do something extreme. And you've probably heard that Max brought out a lot of big-name folks to go hunting, like Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker and Tom Yockey and Mickey Cochran. And Mr. Eric Rossborough from the McCracken here has done a great job documenting Max Wild and all these sports celebrities who came out hunting here with him. Okay, the TE Ranch. Like I said, the TE location was originally the upper cow camp of the Belknap outfit. In 1895, a saloon keeper from Red Lodge named John Burns acquired this cow camp, and he started raising sheep. But apparently that didn't really work out really well. His neighbors probably didn't like sheep for reasons we don't have time to get into. And maybe he was just a better saloon keeper than he was a rancher. So he sold the place in 1897 to Buffalo Bill Cody, and he started a different saloon in Cody, right where the Trailhead Pizza is, called, this is my favorite name for a saloon, Family Liquor. Cody had recently become engaged in a business venture to irrigate and settle the Bighorn Basin, and he had his mining stuff up at Needle Creek. So a ranch with prime access to the mountains is exactly what Buffalo Bill wanted. There's Buffalo Bill right there, and that is actually, this is John Davis right here to his left. And what Cody actually bought from Burns was not any actual property, because no property existed. It was just the homestead claim, not the homestead, the squatter's rights, the right of first refusal when someone did eventually file a homestead, and whatever buildings were there. And in a few years, Cody and his sister, Mary Decker, filed 2 adjacent homesteads that would be consolidated to create the original TE Ranch. And Cody named it the TE after the brand that his cattle had. And he brought in these cattle from a guy that he bought them from in South Dakota, Deadwood, South Dakota, and it's speculated that the brand, people always ask me at my job, what does TE stand for? I've heard that it stands for Trails End, although I can't substantiate that. And Cody's ranch house at the TE was this sort of single-story log structure with a few separate rooms, and the logs were painted bright white. Victorians sort of love bright white because it's different from the dirt and grime and industry of the late 1800s. And when it was built in the 1890s, it would have been a pretty spacious and nice place for the neighborhood. And towards the end of his life, Buffalo Bill wanted to turn the TE into a dude ranch because he looked at all of his neighbors to see how they were making money, and they were all bringing in guests. And he wanted to do that, but then he died in 1917, and the dude scheme kind of never really went anywhere. But Cody's estate sold the place to Stanley Groves, who was an East Coast businessman who had fallen in love with the South Fork during numerous visits to Aldrich Lodge, just down the river. And Monty Jones was the manager of the TE when the Groves family owned it. Remember, he was the brother of Joe Jones of the Majo, so all of this is very incestuous out on the South Fork, all the same people kind of moving around. And Monty Jones homesteaded a piece of land just to the south of the original TE, and then that was incorporated into the ranch. And Groves kept some cattle out there, kind of just for fun, but he also made significant improvements to the accommodation so it would be a comfortable vacation spot for his friends and family. He built other cabins, and then this big lodge over here. Here are these other cabins. Here's Cody's original cabin right there. Here's this big lodge, those cabins, and you can see the whitewashed original ranch house. In 1930, Mr. Groves committed suicide because the stock market crash wiped out his finances. The ranch was then sold to Paul Patton of Kansas City, who died in 1939. So Robert Woodruff of Atlanta, Georgia, bought the property. And Woodruff was president and later chairman of the Coca-Cola Company, and he really helped Coke move from a soda fountain novelty into the global leviathan of beverages, of all beverages. And he was familiar with the South Fork because he had visited on several occasions to go hunting with Max Wild. And the Woodruff family kept the ranch and many of its buildings, many of the buildings that Cody had built and Stanley Groves had built. And they preserved many of the historic features, and they also they furnished the place into this monument of Molesworth design. In 1972, Woodruff sold the ranch to his Coca-Cola associate, Mr. Charles Duncan, and the Duncan family still own the TE and kind of run it as a working cattle ranch and have preserved a lot of the property in great condition. And I should thank Mary Ann Dingus, who gave me a tour of the ranch a few years ago, and her family's really interested in preserving a lot of that cool history out there. A little south of the TE, Buffalo Bill also had the Bobcat Ranch. And this is where Buffalo Bill's sister, Mary Decker, and her husband, Louie, lived. Before Buffalo Bill died, he sold the Bobcat to a Wild West show cowboy named Carly Downing. And Downing's actually the guy who received title and homesteaded that piece of land, but he couldn't afford taxes on it. So Millward Simpson got it in a delinquent tax sale in the 1930s, and the Simpsons have owned it ever since. The Siggins Triangle X Ranch was composed of two adjacent homesteads of Ray Siggins and Bert Cogswell, which were proved up in 1919. The Siggins ran some cattle on this ranch, but just like everyone else, realized that there were just better financial prospects taking in guests. So they reoriented the ranch towards the hospitality business. And this is a great photo of those three brothers, Don, Harold, and Ray. And the Siggins family owned the Triangle X until the 1980s, and then they sold it, and it was renamed the Double Diamond X. Brother Don Siggins also made a homestead on Hardpan Creek in the late 1930s, a little ways above the TE. and this was the Siggins Double L Bar. And this place was sold to Una Kaufman in 1924, who had previously visited on a hunt with Max Wild. And this is where the artist Lawrence Tenney Stephen lived, guy who sort of created the cowboy deco style, which heavily influenced Mr. Molesworth. Then in 1955, the Siggins bought the old Aldrich Lodge area called the Quarter Circle AH, and the Siggins owned that until a few years ago when they sold it to the TE. And we're almost done, but no program on the South Fork would be complete without mentioning the notorious, the famous, the infamous Anson Eddy. Anson was from Vermont, and as a young man he went to Canada, and he fought in World War I for Canada, and then he joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and he married an Indian woman, but that didn't go well, so he left, and he not only left her, he left the entire country of Canada, and for some reason kind of moseyed down here to Wyoming and the South Fork and set up a homestead along Ishua Creek. And he was mainly occupied running trap lines up in the thoroughfare and working as a hunting guide for Max Wild. And if you've ever been to the thoroughfare, you might have seen one of his cabins at the mouth of Pass Creek there. We could talk about Anson Eddy all day, and maybe someone should for a local lore talk, but my favorite detail about Anson Eddy is because he was a cat guy. He had about 20 cats at his little cabin. So maybe cats are a better pet for like mountain men who are like gone the majority of the time than some needy dog. In 1960, New York artist Bob Myers bought the old Glenn Holman homestead just across Ishua Creek, and they called it the Circle M Ranch. It's now the Mariposa. And Bob Myers wasn't always well liked by a lot of his neighbors on the South Fork. They didn't always see eye to eye on private property. He and Anson had an ongoing feud about letting Anson access his homestead through the Myers property. Because Anson he wasn't really a car guy. And his friends would bring him supplies to the South Fork. And the best and easiest automobile access to Anson's place was through Myers' place. And this festering animosity took a violent turn in 1970 when Myers was shot while he and his wife were out fixing fence on their ranch. And Anson Eddy was the prime suspect, was arrested for the murder, but a local jury acquitted him of all the charges because, among other things, the prosecution couldn't link the bullet that had killed Myers to one of Anson's rifles. And there are other issues with this too. Anson Eddy died at 88 in 1982, and he willed his property to about a dozen people so it would never be subdivided, which is maybe one of the best ideas that Anson ever made. So we'll end it there. I'm already over time, and we only talked about just the tip of the iceberg here. So I'm really inspired that you people want to learn about local history. I love this stuff. I love doing research on this. I always learn so many things being forced to do these talks. Because if no one records these and publicizes all these stories, we're going to lose them, we're going to forget them, and then we're all kind of living in collective historical amnesia where no one knows anything about the history of the place where we all live. So thank you for that. If you need to go to I know I went long, so if you need to go back to work or leave, I won't be offended, but I'll be happy to sit here and take questions or angry comments about how I didn't mention your family and they're super important.
Any questions for Brian? Questions for Brian?
Do you have any sense of the economics of the value of all these properties, because they've become relatively recently all very expensive, fancy places, at least big ones. Back then, you talk about so-and-so bought this, and so-and-so bought that, and so-and-so bought this. And was it comparable, or were they not nearly as exotic back then?
I think as soon as dudes started buying these places, the prices inflate pretty fast. Because after after a while, pretty early in the 1920s and 30s, a lot of these ranches are just traded between dudes. They're not actually sold back to like working ranchers. So, I mean, I haven't looked at old real estate records, but I get the impression that they're gentrified pretty quickly and they're built up pretty quickly.
Any other questions? I'll get you in the
I'll
back.
just talk really loud.
Okay.
When you have all the cattle that were roaming and they're basically all mixed together, correct?
Yes.
Then how did they really, when they came in twice a year, all the ones that weren't branded, how did they know who they belonged to?
So they don't come in twice a year. The cowboys go out to them twice a year, and they roam around to different places. One of the things, if you're really interested in open range cattle ranching around here, read Otto Frank's diary. He wrote a diary of ranch operations in the late 1880s, early 1890s, and he talks about these roundups going around the Bighorn Basin. And so what they would do, every ranch would send a representative who would say, okay, that's ours, that calf is from that cow, we're branding it with our brand. But I think kind of what you're getting at is there's a lot of fast and loose antics that go on, and that breeds a lot of rustling, which is, again, a whole other topic that I would love to talk about. In January, I'm giving a talk for the Cody Culture Club about just about open range cattle ranching, and I'll talk about the issue of cattle rustling and just how pervasive it was. Because it's very easy for small settlers who are out on the landscape to be like, oh, that cattle's not branded. I'm going to brand it with my brand, which then makes these big ranchers angry. And then you have something like the Johnson County War where this all kind of comes to a head. Or you have Jack Bliss, who was a horse thief who was killed up at the head of the South Fork in 1893 because the ranchers basically put a hit out for him. Or Birch and Bedford, who were other wranglers who are rustlers who were killed kind of over by Otto. So yeah, there's not a airtight system of making sure specific ranches' cattle stay within their brand. But hey, it would have been really expensive and it would have eaten into profits to actually figure out and keep tabs on all your cattle. So, you know, I don't know. It's a weird system.
Yes, sir. Any other questions for Brian? Yes, in the back.
I can just yell out. Could you comment on a role Andy Martin played?
Could you comment on Andy Martin?
Yeah, Andy Martin was a lower South Fork guy. He had originally settled in the Marquette area. Andy Martin, his family lived in the Marquette area, kind of along the very lower North Fork. And then when that area flooded, he moved to the lower South Fork, right by Andy Martin Hill. And he was a general cattle rancher. He was really a community leader on the lower South Fork. He was a county commissioner, among other things. And yeah, and I don't have I don't have an entire encyclopedia in my head to name off everything he did, but he was a very important member of the lower South Fork community.
Yes.
What is this picture? It's really interesting.
Yeah, so this is a collection, this is a community gathering of South Fork folks, probably in about 1911. And I wish I could make it bigger and, again, show you how all these people are dressed, because you have, over on the right here, guys, cowboys in woolly chaps. And then you have what look like to be some like forest rangers right here. You also have people in like full suits over here, guys in top hats. So it's probably local ranchers and a bunch of dudes in the mix who just had a big community picnic. And yeah, I love this photo because it shows that, hey, sometimes neighbors do get along. They aren't just shooting each other and killing each other.
Yes, sir.
One question. The Valley Cemetery. Have you gone and looked at the cemetery? It's quite interesting.
Yeah. One of the projects that I would love to do in the future is like do a tour of the Valley Cemetery and the Bull Creek Cemetery and just talk about all the names that are buried out there, because I feel like they're kind of lost to history. And that's a really cool place. Those places are really cool ranch cemeteries that are special things. Okay, thank you very much. I'm pretty exhausted. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was terrific.